I've been thinking this week about the Jewish people and the stories of Hanukkah. Hanukkah falls early this year. The last night of Hanukkah is actually tomorrow. It is another example of time feeling really differently these days. We've had many years where Hanukkah was right on top of Christmas Eve, but this year it's a little early. You'll remember Hanukkah is the story of a people who have been oppressed for generations, unable to return to their place of worship, until a small group of rebels called the Maccabees rise up and take back their temple. So the Jewish people, they're celebrating, they're overjoyed, they're returning until they realize they don't have the materials they need for the festival that they want to have. They don't have enough oil. When I realized, thinking about this this week, for the first time, I realized just how absurd this is. That is, that they wouldn't have enough oil. They have been waiting generations for, after all, to get back into that temple and to perform this festival. And they didn't think to make sure that they had the very thing they'd need in order to do what they'd been longing to do. I mean, they had decades, centuries even, to plan for this oil. And all they needed was 8 days worth. But then they get to the temple and only then realize there's only enough for one day. How could this happen? Did they too have problems with their supply chain? Sorry, couldn't resist. You all were thinking it too. But really, how is it possible after all this time that they weren't prepared? The story of Hanukkah is set in a time when many people were foretelling the end of the world and the revealing of a new world. It was an apocalyptic age. That is the sort of age, the sort of time that people prepare for. The people that prepare for those worst case scenarios, either for the whole world or worst case scenarios for just their particular part of the world. And by people who prepare, I mean someone other than me. I have never been a prepper. I have to be honest. I grew up in the Northwest and I never owned an umbrella till I moved to Colorado. So I've never been a prepper in any sort of the term, but I have often been fascinated by that mindset of people who prepare for those worst case scenarios. Growing up, I babysat for a family that one day I went down to their basement and I realized they had gallons, like whole rooms of water jugs stockpiled in it down there. And which, being in the Northwest, was really confusing to me because there's like literally water everywhere. But one of my friends actually had a bomb shelter growing up because it was the 80s. I asked every time I went over to their house if we could go see it. I was even mesmerized by my grandmother's pantry with its rows and rows and shelves of canned goods. Every time she went to the grocery store, she'd still get one or two more just in case. To prepare for the worst to happen requires a certain kind of pessimistic psychology, or at least a bias towards cynicism. Because at least in those most extreme cases, preppers aren't just thinking that the world's going to end. That's one thing, but that the world ending will bring out the worst in people, thus requiring their individual, independent preparation, their stockpiling, etc. Preparing gives you a sense of control. After all, you might not be able to fix everything, including other people, but at least you'll be ready. Ready for whatever you believe could happen. Over the years, of course, people have shifted what they assess could happen based on their sense of their biggest threat, depending on what is going on culturally and collectively. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a strong sense of potential economic collapse and famine in the wake of widespread inflation. So preppers prepared for that. In the 1980s, again, a nuclear annihilation, obviously. The 90s started up the freak out over the Y2K apocalypse. Remember that? It was also when that time in the 90s when stockpiling guns went berserk, which was only amplified by the September 11th attacks and our increasing understanding of the impact of climate change. The housing crisis and economic collapse of 2008 renewed people's fears about economic instability. And in this last decade, there was that increasing sense of a threat of global pandemics, except in this case, the preppers were right. In March 2020, every prepper felt redeemed. Suddenly, your crazy uncle seemed not so crazy, and every Walking Dead fan could claim credible expertise. While the rest of us tried to figure out just how much toilet paper a person would need in a pandemic, and the only answer that we could figure out was more. Beyond the stockpiling in those early days of the pandemic, others started taking up gardening or maybe just expanding their existing gardening, started canning and bread making, all this because we were home more, of course, but also because there was a sense we might need these skills, these capacities in new ways. Others over this time have bought generators, learned to filter water, or learned other new survival skills. Many of us built greater relationships with our neighbors, something that many preppers would recommend, because alongside the notion that survivalists talk about looking out for themselves, most will also acknowledge that actual survival requires relationships and community. Now, though it might seem counterintuitive, given that it creates a degree of less economic stability, the so-called Great Resignation, that is the wave of people leaving jobs, is also connected to these impulses to prepare. After all, if the end is near, spending our days in long-suffering service to those who would sacrifice little stops making much sense. Now, I confess to buying myself a few extra cans of beans and a few things to store in the freezer when we first went into lockdown. The moment I really started to feel more urgent in my own apocalyptic preparations was in the fall of 2020, when the wildfires came close. Suddenly, the stories Octavia Butler wrote about in the parable of the sower seemed less like science fiction and more like prophecy. Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower, was written in 1993. So it was written in 1993, but it takes place in the year 2024. It tells about a society collapsing in the wake of climate change, economic inequality, and corporate greed. Yeah, it starts to feel less like science fiction and more like prophecy. It's 2022, by the way, in case you need a reminder of the time. So 2020, it's almost 2022. And so just about 2 years till 2024. The main character in the parable of the sower, Lauren O'Melina, recognizes that things are only getting worse. So she starts planning for full-on societal collapse. She makes what she calls her go bag, an emergency survival kit filled with the things that she thinks she'd need if she needed to pick up and go quickly, which before too long, she must. Last October, when the fires came close, I started to think seriously about packing my family's go bags, which isn't just about what's in a bag, but also what are the plans for escape, where we would go, and with whom. Maybe for others, this impulse was born over the extremes of the hurricane season, or the Texas freeze and the power grid failure, or the unrest due to racial injustice and the rise of white nationalism, the attacks on our capital. Over these last 2 years, doomsday hasn't felt like it required all that much pessimism, just a willingness to see the world for what's really going on. Apocalypse at its roots means to disclose or uncover. like as in the book of Revelations. At the time of the Maccabean uprising, which led to the people returning to their temple unprepared though they were, there was a sense of profound change and revelation everywhere. A feeling that the evils of this world were coming to an end so that a new age could begin. Now, often when we tell these stories, we focus on the celebration that is the triumph of that new world that is coming. But the reality of apocalypse is that for a long time, it is just the experience of the evils than it is the world, the new world itself. It is the longing for the new world in the midst of despair, which is to say, it was a traumatic time, a chaotic time, a time of fear and struggle. By the time the Jewish people returned to the temple, they had known trauma for generations, some would say most of their history. Last week, Sean spoke about the impact of trauma over generations, the ways that the injury of trauma gets coded in our bodies, alongside our coping techniques and adaptations, and how moving on without tending to the harm inhibits our imaginations and keeps us caught in patterns we don't understand. And so we have to imagine that for all the ways the Jewish people might have been longing for so long to return to that temple, their preparations over the years were not focused on that happy ending, which would have been totally outside their imaginations by then. They'd surely stopped longing for oil long ago. They needed all their efforts instead to prepare for whatever the next disaster would be. The biggest threat, like nuclear annihilation or Y2K or the next variant or the next wildfire season. Whatever big worry any of us might be holding in our minds and hearts these days. Over time, if trauma goes on, chaos continues as it did for the Jews, we ultimately come to the limits of our own preparation. We stop preparing to survive, and we just survive. Which is why when the rabbis told the story of Hanukkah years later, they told not just about the uprising of the Maccabees or how the people returning to the temple did not have enough oil. They also told how the people decided to light the lamp anyway. Despite the fact that they had not stockpiled sufficiently, the rabbis wanted to remind us that sometimes preparation isn't about getting more stuff or getting more stuff done. Sometimes preparation isn't about what you do, it is more about who you are and whose you are. In their case, preparation was like the lessons of the rain and the umbrella. For all those years in exile, they had not forgotten what mattered most, their deepest loyalties and commitments. Despite the chaos and confusion of their age, they remained focused on their faith, their trust in their God, that is, their trust in the ultimacy of life in a greater sense, that there was more at work than they could see or control or understand. And it was this choice, this surrender to mystery and possibility beyond what they could see, that made the miracle of Hanukkah possible. That the oil was insufficient became, in their trusting act, more than enough. In our own apocalyptic age, that is this time where so much remains unpredictable and confusing, and also so much is being uncovered, revealed. This story, this is such good news, because it reminds us that we cannot effort our way through this. And by this, of course, I mean the pandemic. I also mean the effects of climate change. I mean our current political mess and the white supremacy and colonialism that is baked into our culture. I mean all of this. We cannot effort or plan our way out of this. And also, I mean the challenges of the everyday. I mean growing up and loving, raising children, finding meaning, grieving, aging. All of these things, global and personal, require planning and effort, of course, but planning and effort are not enough. Our plans, it turns out, will not save us. And sometimes our plans can even get in the way. Because sometimes when we are so focused on making sure that we thought of everything, prepared ourselves for everything, controlled everything, we forget to make room for all the things that are beyond our imagination and beyond our will, beyond our control. I mean, imagine if the Jewish people had spent centuries focused on ensuring they had enough oil. As the decades and centuries passed, this practical preparation would likely distract them from their deeper commitment, that is, the orientation of the heart that was needed, both to sustain them through their long exile. And also, such a focus would keep them from seeing when the time came that the oil they had in the temple was already enough. Preparation is not always a to-do list. Sometimes it is a letting go and a laying down, a letting in. Sometimes preparation is not control. It is a surrender to all the things we cannot control so that we can more fully accept and receive what is. For this December, the second December of our global pandemic, I wonder what it would mean to prepare ourselves like this. To set down the worries of what if, even for a few days, or if that's too much, like a few hours. To release ourselves from the needing to know, the refreshing of the news or the social feed, the constant stimulation, the idolatry of understanding, to find ourselves for a time at home in the profound mystery. To embrace confusion and chaos as a part of life, even a gift too. To slow down and honor the trauma that we've been through, that we're still going through, with compassion. Compassion for ourselves and for others. And to know that this suffering will not be relieved on our timeline. And it will not be forever. And to accept, as Richard Rohr describes, that we cannot demand history be completed in our lifetimes. We can't demand that history be completed in our lifetimes, for we must know that to be human is to live without closure. This is the sort of preparations that Christians talk about in the season of Advent. That is this time where we set aside our limited and limiting plans to believe again that a better world is still possible, that beloved community is on its way, if only, like the innkeeper of the Christmas story, we will make room. Make room for the stranger, and whatever that means for you. Whatever and whomever feels totally unknown and confusing, like it would throw off your schedules and your routines. In this season, we are invited to prepare for that sort of stranger. We are invited to set aside our worst case scenario mantras and instead turn to wonder and curiosity and a willingness to be totally surprised. even totally wrong. Every day, love offers itself to us in partnership and hope in the least expected ways. Every day, there are moments of grace that we miss with our busyness and our assumptions and our need for control. We are so full, we cannot receive. Every day, people are kind and generous, and pockets of community and creativity are flourishing. The geese fly in formation in the vast sky overhead every day. This year and every year, Christmas comes, and the light will return, and the oil will be enough, regardless of our striving or our planning. And so let us soften our hearts, release all we can, and center ourselves on all that matters most, so that we might be truly prepared for joy. Amen, and blessed be.